The year is 2024, and China is well on its way to becoming one of the most powerful nuclear powers on the planet. According to the Arms Control Association, the nation has 410 nuclear weapons in storage, with the Pentagon believing that Beijing isn't going to stop there. By 2035, it's anticipated that China will have 1,500 active warheads, about equal to Russia and the US itself, and have the capability to strike anywhere on the planet with those missiles. On top of all this, China has established itself as a global leader in nuclear power. Its 23 nuclear power plants may only account for 5% of the nation's energy needs, with coal handling the vast majority of the rest. But China isn't going to stop at 23 plants. CNBC says almost 75% of nuclear reactors that are currently under construction are being built by nations that aren't a part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. Half of those new reactors are being built in China. All of this leaves us with a question: how did we get here? China has developed from an almost lame duck nation during World War II into one of the world's greatest military and nuclear powerhouses. To understand just how it did that, we first need to take a trip back to 1945 and the only direct display of nuclear power the world has ever seen: America dropping bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As World War II drew to a close, Japan's Imperial Army represented as much of a threat to China as it did the United States. The Second Sino-Japanese War had been raging since 1937, with some commentators even saying that the war's beginning was the actual start of World War II, and China was losing. A puppet Japanese regime was created in Nanking in 1940 with the aim of convincing China that Japan would treat it fairly. The regime failed. As the war dragged to its conclusion, the United States appeared as an unlikely ally to China. From early 1994, the states were flying war materials into China via India, as well as providing training to the country's pilots and mechanics. American and Chinese planes attacked Japanese strongholds within China, while the American war effort elsewhere forced many Japanese troops to withdraw so they could fight the Allies in the Pacific Islands. China and its communist armies were slowly but surely liberating areas that had been under Japanese control for several years. But the United States had bigger plans in mind. It had finally developed nuclear weapons, and it saw them as a way to quickly end its war with Japan. On August 6, 1945, the US dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. On August 9th, the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. That September, Japan officially surrendered, and the war was won. But in dropping the bombs, the US had unwittingly turned itself into an enemy of China, though the ramifications weren't immediately apparent. Once it had successfully fought off the Japanese, helping to liberate China in the process, the United States had hoped that China would become one of the chief stabilizing influences in the East. There was just one problem: China had a growing communist contingent. Attempting to get ahead of the issue, America tried to mediate between the ruling Kuomintang Party and China's Communist Party, led by Chairman Mao Zedong. It failed. A civil war broke out between the Kuomintang Party and Mao's communist troops, ultimately resulting in a victory for Mao in 1949. He assumed the self-proclaimed role of chairman of the new People's Republic of China and quickly set about forming an alliance with the Soviet Union. After tense negotiations with Joseph Stalin, Mao succeeded in creating a treaty of mutual assistance, with some economic aid coming from the Soviet Union, to secure his party's immediate future. This was bad news for the United States. Its hopes of China being a stabilizing force in the East were dashed because the new chairman took the country in a direction the US didn't want to see it go. China became communist, and in doing so, China became an enemy of the US. In response to this turn of events, the United States and its president, Harry Truman, pledged their support to Taiwan against any possible attack from mainland China. Truman also sent the 7th Fleet into the waters that separated Taiwan and China to act as a barrier between the two, as well as a show of strength to Chairman Mao. The move influenced Mao, who in 1949 had proclaimed the importance of unifying Taiwan into China to create one China. A year later, Truman had shown that the US would oppose those plans. In 1954, the new US President, Dwight Eisenhower, signed a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan that made America's promise of protection official. Now, the US wasn't just actively defending Taiwan, but deploying nuclear weapons to the small nation. These moves weren't the only ones that upset Mao. On June 25, 1950, war erupted between South and North Korea. Seeing North Korea as a potential communist ally, Mao likely intended to support North Korea with Chinese forces. America knew this. In response, the US sent 10 B-29 bombers to the Pacific, each configured to drop nuclear weapons to send a message to China. Enter this war, and China will suffer the same fate as Japan. So began claims from China that the United States was using nuclear blackmail to dictate how it wanted to see the rest of the world run. These claims were reinforced by less than encouraging messages that emerged from the United States during and after the Korean conflict. In 1954, General Curtis LeMay, then the commander of U.S. Strategic Air Command, said there are no suitable strategic air targets in Korea when talking about America's potential response to a resumption of hostilities between North and South Korea. However, he said, I would drop bombs in proper places like China, Manchuria, and southeastern Russia. LeMay went on to refer to the statement as an example of the poker games that the U.S. would have to play on a global geopolitical level, but to China it was yet another threat from the United States about what would happen if it attempted to invade South Korea to support its northern ally. All of these issues were the prelude to what would come next. China starts to build its first nuclear bomb. Toward the end of 1954, China established the Third Ministry of Machinery Building, later renamed to the Second Ministry and now dubbed the China National Nuclear Corporation, to start working on a nuclear weapon. But Mao had a problem. His scientists had no idea how to build a nuclear bomb. But it didn't need to because it had an ally in the form of the Soviet Union. Both during and after World War II, Russia had focused all of its efforts on achieving parity with and eventually exceeding the United States' nuclear capabilities. It had succeeded, and according to the Nuclear Weapons Education Project, was more than happy to help China in its quest to become a nuclear power. After all, China was a communist nation, the Soviet Union was a communist collective of countries. Even if the two quibbled over the specifics of their shared doctrine, they could unite to present the strongest possible opposition to their common capitalist enemies. In the spirit of this cooperation, the Soviets shared secrets with the Chinese, helping Mao to establish Beijing's Institute of Physics and Atomic Energy. At the same time, Soviet scientists aided China in developing a gaseous diffusion uranium enrichment plant, giving China the ability to create weapons-grade uranium for its bomb. Then came 1957. It was in this year that the Soviet Union agreed to send one of its atomic bombs, along with data explaining how the bomb worked, to Beijing. Now equipped with an understanding of how to build the bomb as well as the uranium it would need in construction, China was in position to create its own nuclear weapons. The work didn't come easy. Though the Soviet and Chinese scientists were cooperating and would continue to do so for several years, China didn't manage to build its first nuke during the 1950s. Worse yet, 1959 brought with it a blow to Mao's ambitions as the Soviet Union declared an end to the mutual exchange that enabled the two countries' nuclear scientists to collaborate and share secrets. The nuclear bond between China and Russia was shattered amidst rising political and philosophical tensions, with each suspecting the other of using the secret shared between the scientists to further their own ends. Still, China persevered. Though it no longer had the Soviets to help it, the country's scientists had learned more than enough to build their bomb, and they could do it without arousing suspicion from the US. Yes, America was aware of the past cooperation between the Soviets and China, but it didn't know how deep that cooperation had extended. Furthermore, the CIA appeared to greatly underestimate China's ability to enrich uranium, with the few satellite images it had of China's enrichment plant doing little to shed light on the issue. The 1950s may not have indicated that China could produce nuclear weapons, but the 1960s told a very different story. On October 16, 1964, China conducted its first successful test of an atomic bomb. Containing enriched uranium produced within the country, the test was a clear message not only to Taiwan but the US. We have the world's most dangerous weapon in our hands. Dubbed Project 596, the test occurred at Lop Nur, with the bomb having a 22 kiloton yield. That was roughly equivalent to Russia's first atomic bomb, the RDS-1, showing that China still had a way to go to catch up to the US and the Soviet Union. Still, it now had a bomb that could cause as much damage as the Fat Man that America had dropped on Nagasaki, sparking alarm within the US. However, if President Lyndon B. Johnson's statement in the wake of the test is to be believed, the US wasn't taken by surprise. He claims that the explosion had been fully taken into account in planning America's own defense program and our nuclear capability. He also warned against overestimating the significance of the test, claiming that it would take China many more years to go from being a nation that could test nuclear weapons to one that would have a stockpile of nukes that had an effective delivery system. In short, he attempted to downplay China's achievement, but he was wrong. China's nuclear program was accelerating at an alarming rate. As for the delivery issue, China was much faster in finding a solution than Johnson had claimed. He failed to account for, or had tactically decided not to tell the American people, about China's Dongfang-2 medium-range ballistic missile. Dubbed the DF-2, the medium-range ballistic missile, or MRBM, had an effective range of 776 miles and could travel at 20 knots. Granted, this was nowhere near enough a range to threaten the US, but South Korea? That might be another story. To demonstrate its new missile delivery system, China took an unprecedented step that hasn't been repeated by any other nation since. It conducted a test launch over civilian-populated areas. After loading a 12-kiloton warhead into the missile, China launched it from the Shuangchengxi missile test site, from which it soared over Gansu province before impacting and detonating at the Lopnur test site. This was a startling move, showing a shocking disregard for the people in the Gansu province. But it was also a display of strength, once more aimed at the US, that showed that China did indeed have the technology to launch its nuclear bombs. Granted, it still didn't have a huge stockpile, but if it needed to launch, it could. There was more. On June 17, 1967, just 32 months after its successful test of an atomic bomb, China completed its first test of a thermonuclear device. No other country had reached that point as quickly. For the US, it had taken 86 months before it could claim to have a hydrogen bomb. Russia had taken 75 months, with the UK requiring 66. France, the fourth nation to build a thermonuclear device, needed 105 months. These successful tests prompted further work in the nuclear arena. During the mid-1960s, Mao implemented his third-line construction policy. This policy stated that China has 3 lines of defense. Its eastern coastal areas were its first, with the central areas being the second. Only far to the west would an invading force find the third line, which would be precisely where Mao would store and continue to build his nuclear arsenal. China's chairman focused on the steel, aerospace, and nuclear industries in his construction efforts. He built redundant facilities within China's interior, ensuring that should an invading force attack its existing facilities to the east, its workers would simply migrate to the west and continue to work. These redundant facilities also had to be staffed in the interim, with Mao fixing this issue by forcefully migrating some unfortunate civilians to the area. That migration might have led to some minor domestic unrest, but that was a small price to pay for shoring up China's defenses. From 1966 to 1975, the third line was a prominent part of China's third and fourth 5-year economic plans. By 1975, the country had a new gaseous diffusion uranium enrichment facility, this one in Heping, with a reactor and an extraction facility capable of producing plutonium. Add to that a new nuclear weapon design factory built in Myeongnyang, as well as a component plant focused on nuclear fuel, and China's third line essentially became its nuclear line. China's advancement had been impressive. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, or CEIP, the country had amassed 75 nuclear weapons by 1975. It was a formidable stockpile, albeit much smaller than those of the US and Russia, which had amassed stockpiles numbering into the thousands by this point. For the rest of the decade, China focused on slowly building up its nuclear arsenal, along with further developing the third line. The 1980s brought with them turmoil in China's leadership. Chairman Mao died in 1976, being succeeded by Hua Guofeng. He lasted 5 years in the role, leading until 1981, before Hu Yaobang took control. He was succeeded by Zhao Ziang in 1987, who served for 2 years, before Jiang Zemin came to power in 1989. He'd eventually lead China through the turn of the millennium. Throughout the 1980s, China focused on consolidating and modernizing its nuclear array. More and more missiles were being built, with the Chinese stockpile stabilizing at between 200 and 260 during the early part of the decade. At this point, a more pressing matter for the country was taking all of its nuclear knowledge and turning it into something new, a way to generate power. In 1985, China began work on the Qinshen nuclear power plant, which would be located in Haiyan County in Zhejiang Province. Phase 1 of this construction process would involve the creation of a small unit capable of generating 300 megawatts of power. It was a slow start, though it was notable because 95% of the components used to design the plant came from domestic manufacturers. Phase 2 occurred between 1996 and 1997, with Phase 3 running throughout 1998. The former saw a pair of 600-megawatt plants of Chinese design being created. Only these plants used steam generators created by the Canadian manufacturer Babcock & Wilcox. As for Phase 3, this involved building a pair of reactors with a gross power of 728 megawatts, this time using a CANDU reactor designed by Atomic Energy of Canada Limited. These latter phases marked an interesting move toward cooperation on the nuclear front as they represented the most significant business dealings between China and Canada up to that point. The plant was officially connected to the grid in 1991, and China could now produce power using nuclear technology. But while it made a slow start in this area, its weapons-based focus lay on treaties and development. In 1994, the country announced a series of tests to improve the safety features of its existing nuclear warheads. However, some believe these tests actually aided the development of the country's first intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, and helped develop multiple warhead capabilities for its missiles. Those tests ran for 2 years before China signed the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, in 1996. That signing showcased a shift in Beijing's approach to nuclear non-proliferation. Previously, China argued that the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, or NPT, was imbalanced and discriminated against other countries trying to develop nuclear weapons. That attitude changed in the 1980s. And in 1990, the country's then premier, Zhao Ziyang, attended the 4th NPT conference. 2 years later, China acceded to the NPT, officially claiming its position as a nuclear weapon state, and in doing so, its commitment to being bound by the NPT. These were logical moves. Ever since its first successful test of nuclear weapons in 1964, China has operated under a no-first-use policy, in which it claimed that it would only use its weapons as a direct response to another country using theirs. By first signing the NPT in 1994, followed by the CTBT in 1996, China became an official part of the nuclear community. But it was not without its scandals. Despite its supposed commitment to non-proliferation, China sold ring magnets used in gas centrifuges that extract weapons-grade uranium from uranium gas to Pakistan in 1995. A year later, the country provided the design for a nuclear bomb to Pakistan, with those designs eventually passing through Pakistan and into Libya. They eventually were discovered by the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, in 2004 when Libya's president, Muammar Gaddafi, announced that the country would no longer pursue nuclear weapons development and manufacture. Libya submitted to IAEA for inspection, which is when documents on how to build an implosion device that contained Chinese text were discovered. Nevertheless, China remained committed to non-proliferation, at least outwardly. Its actions might have told another story, but it no longer seemed to be engaged in clandestine nuclear weapons production. Instead, the country focused on developing more nuclear plants. As part of China's economic reforms triggered at the turn of the millennium, the country focused on expanding its electricity sector. Its 10th five-year plan, which covered 2001 to 2005, included a commitment to guarantee energy security. Wide-scale construction of new nuclear plants started, all in aid of China reaching a planned capacity of 58 gigawatts by 2020. However, those plans didn't come to fruition thanks in part to the Fukushima nuclear plant disaster in Japan. The world's second worst nuclear accident triggered a slowdown in Chinese nuclear plant creation, likely so they could reevaluate safety measures. Still, China managed to reach a total installed capacity of just over 51 gigawatts and has plans to increase that to 200 by 2035, ideally accounting for 10% of the country's power needs. But where China's nuclear power plant expansion is inward-focused, ideally eliminating its reliance on coal, its approach to nuclear weapons over the last decade has been more worrying. China is strengthening, and its change in approach all comes down to the rise of one man, Xi Jinping. By 2015, China focused almost exclusively on domestic weapon design and manufacturing, both conventional and nuclear. Granted, it still imports the occasional piece of equipment, such as jet engines from Russia, but China has a clear goal of developing one of the most impressive militaries on the planet. And with that military comes immense investment into nuclear warhead manufacture and the design and development of new ways to launch those warheads. Under Jinping's reign, China has built 6 Shang-class submarines, named the Type 94, that are capable of firing submarine-launched ballistic missiles, or SLBMs, that can travel thousands of miles. Its current SLBMs, the JL-2s, are currently being replaced by the longer-range JL-3 missiles, which the Nuclear Threat Initiative says are capable of traveling about 6,200 miles. China is also focusing on creating new ICBMs. Ever since July 1986, the country's Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, or CALT, has been working on an ICBM called the Dongfang 41, or DF-41, capable of carrying a 5,500-pound payload. This lethal ICBM can carry up to 10 nuclear warheads and is both road and rail mobile. Its maximum range is believed to be somewhere between 7,450 and 9,320 miles, giving it almost triple the range of America's Minuteman III ICBMs. And it's been tested extensively. According to the CSIS Missile Defense Project, the first official test of the DF-41 took place in July 2012. A year later came a launch from Wuzhai, and 2014 and 2015 brought tests of launches including multiple nuclear warheads. It's a masterpiece of nuclear warhead delivery design, and it's well beyond anything that the United States currently has to offer. It's also emblematic of Xi Jinping's approach to China's nuclear policy as we draw deeper into the 2020s. Maintaining warheads for purposes of national defense is no longer enough. China can no longer simply be a nuclear power. It must become the nuclear power. That's why the country's stockpiles are growing at such a rapid rate. The 1,500 warheads the Pentagon claims China will have built by 2035 will put the country into parity with Russia and the United States, with its massive delivery systems being among the best the world has to offer. Add to that an increasing reliance on nuclear power, which encourages more research that could aid the country's weapons production, and China has evolved into a genuine nuclear threat. Whether that threat will ever be realized is anybody's guess, especially given China's supposed commitment to not using its nukes first. But one thing is for certain, China has come a long way in the nuclear race since it first started trading secrets with the Soviets in the 1950s to counteract America's nuclear blackmail. Are you impressed by the many steps China took and continues to take on its journey to becoming a genuine nuclear power? How do you think the United States, as well as other nuclear powers like Russia, should respond to China's growing arsenal? Tell us in the comments section below, then check out why China will never be a global superpower, or watch this video instead.